The wind screamed across the frozen plains of Varth 9 like a wounded animal, and the temperature had dropped so low that even the hardiest machines struggled to function. In the bitter cold that night, Myra Voss stood at her window and watched the white wall of snow slam against the reinforced glass of her homestead, and she wondered if this storm would ever end, because it had been raging for 3 days now without any sign of stopping. She was 58 years old, with gray hair that she kept short and practical, and her hands were rough from decades of work on starships and later on this frozen farm at the edge of nowhere that she called home. The Draconian Empire had taken the good worlds from humanity long ago, and they had pushed the human colonists to places like this where survival was a daily battle against nature itself. Myra did not complain because complaining changed nothing, and she had learned that lesson the hard way during the conquest when she watched her home world fall to the dragon lords and their massive warships that blocked out the sun. She turned away from the window and checked their heating core readings on the old terminal that hummed in the corner of her living space, and the numbers looked stable enough to last through the storm if she was careful with her fuel reserves. The geothermal vents near her homestead provided most of her heat, but on nights like this she needed to burn extra fuel just to keep the pipes from freezing solid. She was about to sit down with a cup of synthetic coffee when her perimeter alarm started blinking red, and she frowned because nothing should be moving out there in this deadly weather. The screen showed 2 large heat signatures about 200 meters from her eastern fence, and they were fading fast, which meant whatever was out there was dying in the cold. Myra pulled on her thermal suit and grabbed her emergency kit and headed for the cargo crawler that sat in her heated garage. And she did not think about whether this was smart or safe, because someone or something needed help. The crawler's engine coughed and groaned in protest, but finally roared to life, and she drove out into the white nightmare of the blizzard with her headlights barely cutting through the wall of snow. She almost drove past them because they were half buried already, but then she saw a flash of dark scales against the white snow, and she slammed the brakes. 2 draconians lay in the snow, and they were enormous creatures with scales that should have been the color of dark copper, but now looked pale and frosted, with ice crystals forming on their massive bodies. Myra had seen draconians before, of course, because everyone in the galaxy had seen the dragon lords who ruled 1,000 worlds with iron claws, but she had never seen any of them look so weak and broken and close to death. Their internal furnaces that normally kept their blood hot enough to survive almost anything had gone cold, and she could see that their breathing was shallow and slow. She should have left them there to die because the draconians had taken everything from her people and treated humans like insects beneath their notice. And no one would blame her for driving back to her warm home and forgetting what she saw. But Myra Voss was not built that way, and she never had been, even when it would have been easier to look away. She spent the next hour rigging up a makeshift sled behind her crawler and using every bit of strength in her aging body to roll the 2 massive dragons onto it. And her muscles screamed and her lungs burned in the frozen air, but she did not stop. The trip back to her homestead took twice as long because of the extra weight, and by the time she got them inside her main living area, she was shaking with exhaustion and cold. They were both ancient. She could tell that much from the deep grooves in their scales and the way their horns had worn smooth with age. And she wondered what 2 old draconians were doing on a frozen waste world like Vareth 9. She did not have time to wonder for long because she needed to get them warm or they would die right there. On her floor, Myra fed every spare fuel cell she had into her heating core and cranked the temperature up until her homestead felt like a furnace. And she wrapped the 2 dragons in every thermal blanket she owned and positioned them near the heat vents. She boiled water and made broth from her emergency protein stores, and she waited for any sign that they might wake up. The first night she did not sleep at all because she kept checking their vital signs with her old medical scanner. And the readings were weak, but stable, which gave her hope. By the second day, their scales had started to regain some color, and their breathing had grown stronger. And Myra allowed herself to rest for a few hours while the storm continued to rage outside. She found herself talking to them even though they could not hear her, telling them about her life on this frozen rock and how she had come here after the war to get away from everything and everyone. On the third morning, the storm finally broke and pale sunlight streamed through her windows. And Mira was in her small kitchen heating more broth when she heard movement behind her. She turned to find two pairs of ancient golden eyes watching her with an expression she could not read. And the larger of the two dragons spoke in a voice like gravel sliding down a mountain. He asked her why she had saved them. And Mira just shrugged and said that they were cold and she had room. The dragon stared at her for a long moment, as if trying to understand something that did not make sense to him. And then he lowered his great head in what might have been respect or confusion or both. Myra handed him a bowl of broth and told him to drink it while it was hot. And she did not know that this simple act of kindness was about to change the fate of worlds. She was just a human woman who had done what any decent person would do. And she had no idea that by morning the Emperor's soldiers would surround her home and demand blood for her mercy. The two ancient dragons sat in Myra's living area, wrapped in thermal blankets that looked almost comical stretched across their massive scaled bodies. And they drank the broth she had made with expressions of deep confusion. The larger one was called Corvash, and his scales were the color of aged bronze with patches of silver around his eyes and along his spine that showed his great age. And he had been silent for a long time after his first question. The smaller one was named Sindara, and her scales were a deep red that had faded to something like rust over the centuries. And she watched Mira with eyes that seemed to be searching for something hidden beneath the surface. Myra went about her morning routine as if having two giant dragons in her home was the most normal thing in the galaxy. And she made herself breakfast and offered them more food and checked the readings on her heating system. Finally, Sindara spoke, and her voice was softer than Corvash's, but carried the weight of someone who was used to being heard by thousands. She asked Myra if she knew who they were and what it meant to shelter them in her home. And Myra admitted that she had no idea because they were just two frozen strangers she found in the snow. Corvash made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a cough. And he explained that they were once the twin voices of the old parliament before the current emperor had seized absolute power. They had spoken against the expansion wars that had crushed dozens of worlds, including the human colonies. And they had argued for the old ways of diplomacy and trade instead of conquest and domination. For their words, they had been sent to something called the Long Exile, which meant being dropped on a frozen death world to die slowly and be forgotten by history. Myra listened to all of this while sipping her coffee. And when they finished, she simply asked if they wanted more broth or if they preferred something solid to eat. Sindara stared at her as if she had grown a second head. And she asked why Myra was not afraid or angry or demanding payment for her help. Myra set down her cup and looked at the two ancient beings who had once held power over billions of lives. And she told them that being afraid would not change anything and being angry was a waste of energy she needed for survival as for payment. She said that she did not save them expecting anything in return, because that was not how kindness worked where she came from. Corvash exchanged a glance with Sindara that seemed to contain an entire conversation, and then he asked her where exactly she came from that taught such strange ideas about kindness to strangers. Mira told them about Earth, the human homeworld that most of her people had never seen but still dreamed about. And she told them about the old stories her grandmother used to share about hospitality and shelter and the sacred duty to help those in need. She told them about the winter her grandmother had taken in a family of refugees during a terrible storm when Myra was just a child, and how her grandmother had given them the last of their food stores. Without hesitation, Cinda said that such behavior would be considered foolish and weak among draconians, and Mira agreed that it probably looked that way from the outside, but she explained that humans had survived ice ages and plagues and wars and the emptiness of space, not because they were the strongest or the smartest, but because they took care of each other when times were hard. Corvish was quiet for a long moment, and then he said that perhaps this was why humans had proven so difficult to truly conquer. Despite their inferior technology and smaller numbers, you can break their cities and take their worlds, he said, but you cannot break whatever it is inside them that makes them give their last blanket to a dying enemy. Myra smiled at that and said that she preferred to think of them as guests rather than enemies, and she offered to show them around her small homestead if they felt strong enough to walk. The rest of that day passed in a strange peace as the two ancient dragons learned about the simple life Myra had built for herself on this frozen frontier. She showed them her small greenhouse, where she grew vegetables under artificial light, and her workshop where she repaired old machines to trade with other settlers, and her collection of paper books that she had carried across the stars because they reminded her of home. Sindara admitted that she had never spent time with a human before except as subjects to be governed or workers to be managed, and she found herself fascinated by the small details of Myra's existence. Corvish stood at the window and looked out at the white plains that had almost been his grave, and he told Myra that he and Sindara had accepted death when they were dropped here. They had expected to walk until their furnaces went cold and their bodies returned to the ice, and they had made peace with that ending because it was still better than rotting in the Emperor's prison. But now they were alive because a human woman had refused to let them die, and he did not know what to do with this gift they had not asked for. Myra put her hand on his massive scaled arm and told him that he did not have to do anything except rest and heal, and that what came next could wait until they were strong again. That night they ate together at her small table with Mira perched on her chair and the two dragons curled on the floor because they could not fit in her furniture, and they talked about things that had nothing to do with empires or wars or politics. They talked about favorite foods and beautiful places they had seen and memories that made them smile. And for a few hours they were not a human and two dragons, but simply three beings sharing warmth against the cold. None of them knew that high above in orbit a surveillance satellite had detected unusual heat signatures from Myra's homestead, and that a report was already speeding toward the Emperor's military command. None of them knew that their peaceful evening was the last quiet moment they would have for a very long time. When Myra finally went to bed, she felt something she had not felt in years, and it took her a moment to recognize it as hope. She was still holding on to that feeling when she woke at dawn to the sound of gunship engines roaring overhead and a voice demanding her surrender. The morning sun had barely risen above the frozen horizon when three Imperial gunships descended from the pale sky like angry metal birds, and their engines shook Myra's homestead so hard that cups rattled off shelves. Myra was out of bed and at the window in seconds, and what she saw made her stomach drop because 200 Talon Guard soldiers were forming a perimeter around her property with weapons drawn. The Talon Guard were the Emperor's elite forces, massive draconians in black armor that made them look like something out of a nightmare. And they were not the kind of soldiers who came to ask polite questions. Corvish and Sindara appeared behind her with their scales still dull from their ordeal, but their eyes sharp and alert. And Corvash said that he was sorry for bringing this doom to her door. Myra told him to be quiet and let her think because panicking would not help. "Anyone right now?" a booming voice came from outside, amplified by military speakers, so loud that Mira could feel it in her chest. And it belonged to Commander Virith, who announced himself as the executor of the Emperor's will. He gave Myra 1 hour to surrender the fugitives, Corvash and Sindara, or face immediate destruction of her home and everyone inside it. And he said this as casually as someone ordering lunch. Mira took a deep breath and turned to face the 2 dragons who had become something like friends in the short time she had known them, and she asked them if they wanted some breakfast before they dealt with this situation. Sindara stared at her with something like amazement and asked how she could possibly be thinking about food at a time like this. Myra explained that she always thought better on a full stomach and that the soldiers could wait because they were not going anywhere, and neither was she. She went to her kitchen and started making coffee and heating up rations while Corvash and Sindara watched her as if she had lost her mind completely. Car finally spoke and said that they would surrender themselves because they would not allow her to die for sheltering them. And Sindara nodded in agreement, even though her eyes were filled with grief. Myra set down her coffee pot and walked over to her front door and locked it with the heavy security bolts she had installed years ago when she first moved to this dangerous frontier. Then she turned to face them and said that no one was surrendering anyone today. She walked to her old communications terminal and began typing commands with the speed and confidence of the starship engineer she used to be. And within minutes, she had accessed every broadband frequency that could reach beyond this frozen world. Corvash demanded to know what she was doing, and Mira told him that she was about to make the Emperor very uncomfortable. She had spent the last hour while they slept recording everything, and now she compiled the footage of 2 ancient and revered parliamentary leaders being hunted by Imperial death squads on an ice world where they had been sent to die in secret. She added her own face and name and coordinates to the transmission so that everyone would know exactly where this was happening and who was responsible. Then she hit the broadcast button and sent it to every news feed and trade network and alien outpost that would listen. And she sat back and picked up her coffee. Agan Sindara asked her if she understood what she had just done, and Mira said that she understood perfectly. She had just made it impossible for the Emperor to kill them quietly, because now the whole galaxy was watching, and any violence would happen in front of witnesses. Corv looked at her with an expression she had never seen on a draconian face before, something between respect and disbelief. And he asked her why she was risking everything for 2 old dragons she had known for only 3 days. Myra thought about the question for a long moment before answering, and when she spoke, her voice was calm and steady. She told them that her grandmother had taught her that the measure of a person was not what they did when it was easy, but what they did when it was hard, and that doing the right thing was never supposed to be safe or simple. She told them that humans had survived so much darkness over their long history by holding on to the light even when it burned their hands, and that she would rather die standing for something than live kneeling for nothing. The hour deadline passed, and Myra stepped out onto her porch with her coffee cup in hand to face Commander Virith and his army of armored killers. Virith was a massive dragon with scales as black as his armor, and he demanded to know if she was ready to hand over the fugitives. Myra took a sip of her coffee and told him that her guests were having breakfast and could he please keep the noise down because some people were trying to enjoy their morning. The commander's eyes widened with fury, and he raised his weapon. But then one of his officers rushed forward and whispered something in his ear. Virith's expression changed from rage to something that looked almost like fear, and he lowered his weapon and stared at Myra as if seeing her for the first time. The broadcast had gone viral. She realized, and now everyone knew what was happening. Her Virith spoke through clenched teeth and told her that she had made a very powerful enemy today, and that the Emperor would not forget this insult. Myra finished her coffee and told him that she was just a farmer who had taken in some guests from the cold, and that if the Emperor had a problem with basic hospitality, then maybe he should look at his own values. She turned and walked back inside her home without looking back. And she locked the door behind her. The siege had begun. But Miravaz had just changed the rules of the game inside. Corvash and Sindara sat in stunned silence. And finally Sindara spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. She said that in all her centuries of life, she had never seen anything quite like what Myra had just done. And she asked if all humans were. This impossibly stubborn Myra smiled and said that stubbornness was practically a human birthright. And she asked if anyone wanted more coffee, because she had a feeling it was going to be a very long day. The Emperor received word of the broadcast while sitting on his throne of black stone, and his advisors watched in terror as his scales flushed dark with rage. Emperor Gelthrax had ruled the Draconian Empire for 300 years through fear and absolute power. And in all that time, no one had dared to challenge him so openly. A human had challenged him. A single aging human woman on a frozen rock at the edge of nowhere. And she had done it with nothing but a camera and a coffee cup. He ordered Commander Virath to destroy the homestead immediately and kill everyone inside. But his chief advisor stepped forward with trembling hands and explained why that would be a catastrophic mistake. The broadcast had spread across 3 sectors in less than 4 hours. And it was still spreading because the alien news networks had picked it up as the story of the century. The merchant guilds who controlled interstellar trade were already making noises about ethical concerns. And the independent worlds were watching closely to see how the Empire would respond if the Emperor killed a defenseless human woman for showing kindness to 2 elderly exiles. He would prove everything his critics had ever said about his brutality. Gelthrax roared with fury and demanded to know what he was supposed to do instead. And his advisors had no answers that would satisfy him. Meanwhile, on Vareth 9, the situation was changing in ways no one had predicted. The 12,000 human colonists who lived on that frozen world had spent years keeping their heads down and trying to survive under draconian rule. But something about Myra's broadcast had sparked a fire in them. They began to gather, first in small groups and then in larger crowds. And they started walking toward Myra's homestead from every settlement on the planet. They came on foot through the snow because most of them did not have vehicles. And they came unarmed because they had no weapons. And they came anyway because they could not stay away by the second day of the siege. There were 300 humans standing outside the military perimeter. And they simply refused to leave. Commander Virath demanded to know what they wanted. And an old man at the front of the crowd said that they wanted to stand with the woman who had reminded them what courage looked like. By the 3rd day, there were 1,000 humans forming a living ring around the soldiers. And the soldiers found themselves surrounded by the very people they were supposed to control. Virath reported to his superiors that firing on Myra's homestead would mean firing through hundreds of human civilians. And he asked for guidance that never came because no one knew what to do. Inside the homestead, Mira watched the growing crowd through her window and felt tears running down her face. For the first time in years, she had lived alone for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to not be alone. And now her people had come for her in ways she never expected. Corvash stood beside her and watched the humans gathering in the snow. And he said that he had conquered worlds and commanded armies, but he had never seen anything like this. These people had nothing. He said, no weapons and no power and no protection. And yet, they came anyway, because one of their own needed them. Sindara joined them at the window and said that this was what she and Corvash had tried to explain to the Emperor all those years ago. That humans were not like other conquered species. You could not break their spirit by breaking their bodies, she said, because their strength came from something deeper that did not care about odds or logic. On the 5th day, something even more unexpected happened. A young Draconian officer in Virath's own command transmitted his resignation code and walked away from his post. And when Virath demanded an explanation, The officer said that he could not serve an emperor who violated the old laws of hospitality. The old laws were ancient traditions that predated the empire itself. Sacred rules that said a host must protect their guests and a guest must honor their host. And they had been ignored for so long that most modern draconians had forgotten them, but the broadcast had reminded them. And suddenly dragons across the galaxy were arguing about whether the emperor had the right to punish someone for following the oldest laws of their own culture by. The seventh day, 24 draconian officers had resigned their commissions, and 3 noble houses had issued public statements questioning the emperor's actions. The merchant guilds announced that they were freezing all shipping contracts with the empire pending an ethical review, which meant that vital supplies and trade goods would stop flowing until this situation was resolved. Mira continued to serve coffee to everyone who would accept it, and she made sure the human civilians outside received hot drinks and food from her supplies, even though it meant she would run out soon. Karvash asked her why she was giving away her own survival rations, and Myra explained that those people had come to stand for her in the cold, and the least she could do was make sure they did not freeze. Sindara shook her head and said that human logic made no sense. Giving away what you needed to survive in order to help others. Survive. Myra smiled and said that it made perfect sense if you understood that survival meant nothing without something worth surviving for. On the 9th day, Commander Virus received new orders from the imperial capital, and when he read them, his face went pale beneath his black scales. The Emperor's Council had voted to revoke the exile order for Korvash and Sindara rather than face economic collapse and internal rebellion. Virus was ordered to withdraw his forces and leave the frozen planet immediately, and he was warned that any action against the human woman or the civilians would be considered treason. He stood before Myra's homestead one last time and told her that she had won this battle, but that the Emperor would never forget what she had done. Myra looked at him with steady eyes and said that she was not trying to fight the Emperor. She was just trying to keep some guests warm. The gunships lifted off and the soldiers marched away, and the human civilians cheered so loud that Mira could hear them through her walls. Karvash and Sindara stood beside her as they watched the Imperial forces retreat, and for a long moment no one spoke. Then Myra said that she needed to make more coffee because it looked like she was going to have a lot of visitors. She was right about that. And she was right about something else too. Everything was about to change. The day after the Imperial forces withdrew, Mira woke up to find her homestead surrounded again, but this time by friends instead of enemies. Hundreds of humans had camped in the snow around her property, and more were arriving every hour from across Vareth-9, and even from other worlds. In the sector ships began landing at the small colony spaceport carrying journalists and diplomats and curious travelers who wanted to see the woman who had faced down the Emperor with nothing but a coffee cup and stubbornness. Myra found the attention overwhelming at first because she had spent so many years alone, and now she could not walk 10 steps without someone wanting to shake her hand or thank her. Korvash and Sindara received offers of sanctuary from 3 different worlds, including a formal invitation from the independent Merchant Republic, who saw political advantage in sheltering the Emperor's most famous enemies. But when Myra asked them what they wanted to do, they exchanged a look and said they wanted to stay right where they were. Sindara explained that they had lived for centuries in palaces and council chambers surrounded by power and politics, and they had forgotten what it felt like to be somewhere that actually mattered. This frozen homestead had become more of a home in days than any palace had been in centuries, and they were not ready to leave it. Karvash added that someone needed to stay and help Myra, because she was clearly going to need all the help she could get with all these visitors arriving. Myra pretended to be annoyed, but she could not hide her smile And she said that if they were going to stay, then they were going to have to help with the cooking because she could not feed this many people. Alone, the weeks that followed were chaos. In the best possible way, human colonists who had lived in fear and poverty for years suddenly found their voices, and they began organizing and demanding better treatment. From the local imperial administrators, the administrators had no idea how to respond because their usual methods of intimidation no longer worked against people who had watched one of their own stare down the Emperor's army. Word spread across the human colonies in other systems, and small acts of defiance began to multiply like sparks from a fire. A worker on a mining colony refused to bow to a draconian overseer and cited the old laws of hospitality. A teacher on an agricultural world started including human history in her lessons, even though it was technically forbidden. A group of engineers sabotaged their own translation of imperial orders, delaying a construction project by months. None of these acts alone were enough to threaten the empire, but together they added up to something the emperor had never faced before. His subjects were no longer afraid, or at least they were no longer more afraid of him than they were inspired by a gray-haired woman on a frozen rock. Myra's homestead became something unexpected over the following months, a meeting place where humans and draconians could talk as equals. The younger dragons who had resigned their commissions came to visit, drawn by curiosity about the woman who had reminded them of their own forgotten traditions. They sat around Myra's table and listened to her tell stories about human history, about all the times her people had been conquered and oppressed and had somehow survived anyway. She told them about resistance movements and underground railroads and people who had hidden strangers in their homes even when discovery meant death. She told them about the small kindnesses that had kept hope alive in the darkest times. A shared meal here and a whispered word of encouragement there. Karvesh listened to these stories with growing wonder. And one evening, he admitted that in all his centuries of studying politics and power, he had never understood why humans kept fighting even when they had already lost. Now he thought he understood. He said, because humans did not fight to win, they fought because fighting was how they held on to who they were, and they would rather die as themselves than live as something less. Indera agreed, and said that this was what made humans the most dangerous species in the galaxy. Not their technology or their numbers, but their absolute refusal to surrender their souls. The Emperor still ruled from his throne of black stone, and the Empire still stretched across 1,000 worlds. But something had cracked in the foundation. More dragons began questioning the expansion wars and the treatment of conquered peoples, and more humans began believing that change was possible. A young draconian journalist traveled to Vareth 9 to interview Mira for a documentary that would eventually be watched by billions across the galaxy. Asked Mira the question that everyone wanted answered: why she had risked everything for 2 old dragons she did not know and had every reason to hate. Myra was quiet for a long time, and when she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady. She said that when she found them in the snow, she did not see enemies or dragons or members of the species that had conquered her. People, she saw 2 living beings who were dying, and she had the power to help them, and that was really all there was to it. The journalist pressed her, asking if she had thought about the consequences, or calculated the risks, or considered what the Empire might do. Mira laughed and said that thinking too much was a good way to talk yourself out of doing the right thing. Sometimes you just had to act from your gut and trust that kindness was never wasted, even when it seemed foolish. The journalist asked one final question: whether Mira thought her actions had really changed anything in the grand scheme of a galaxy-spanning empire. Mira looked out the window at the plains of snow that had nearly killed her guests and then saved them, and she thought about the thousands of humans who had stood in the cold for her. She thought about the young dragons questioning their emperor and the small rebellion spreading across distant worlds. She said that empires look so strong from the outside, like mountains that would stand forever, but they were really built on something much more fragile. They were built on the belief that power was the only thing that mattered, that kindness was weakness and cruelty was strength. The one open door could prove that belief wrong. One act of stubborn mercy could remind people that there was another way to live. She said that she did not know if she had changed the galaxy, but she knew that she had changed herself and her guests and everyone who had stood with her in the snow, and maybe that was enough. Because galaxies were made of people after all, and people could always choose to be better than they were taught to be. Journalist ended her documentary with footage of Mira serving coffee to a room full of humans and dragons laughing together. And the final words on the screen were the ones that Mira had spoken on her first morning with her unexpected guests. They were cold, and I had room. Those words spread across the stars and became something like a prayer for everyone who believed that compassion was stronger than fear. And somewhere on a frozen world at the edge of nowhere, an old human woman smiled and put on another pot of coffee because she had a feeling more guests would be arriving soon. That was just fine with her. She always kept extra. You never knew who might come in from the cold.